The CEO's laughter echoed through the five-star Dubai restaurant as he made his cruel offer, $7 million if the waitress could serve him in proper Arabic. His table of executives smirked, certain they were watching a simple refugee being put in her place. But what happened next would shatter every assumption in that room and prove that the most dangerous person in any negotiation is the one you've already underestimated. That waitress was Layla Hassan, a 28-year-old linguistics graduate who had fled the Syrian war with nothing but her education and her resolve. She spoke 8 languages: classical Arabic, Emirati dialect, French, English, Mandarin, German, Spanish, Russian. But in Dubai, her credentials meant nothing. She was invisible, just another refugee serving overpriced meals to executives who never looked her in the eye. Across the world, millions of educated immigrants face the same fate, their skills wasted, their dignity ignored. But on this night, Layla would deliver a response so precise, so devastating, that it would expose the arrogance behind that $7 million joke and force a reckoning no one saw coming. Layla was born in Damascus, in a home where words were more valuable than money. Her father, Dr. Samir Hassan, taught comparative linguistics at Damascus University, and their modest apartment was stacked floor to ceiling with books in a dozen languages. By age 10, Layla could switch between Arabic, French, and English without hesitation, not because she studied them, but because they simply lived inside her. Her father would test her at dinner, tossing phrases in different tongues, and she would respond in perfect rhythm, her young mind a sponge that never stopped absorbing. By the time she enrolled at her father's university, she had added German and Spanish. Her professors believed she would become one of Syria's great linguistic minds. She dreamed of interpreting for diplomats, of bridging worlds that rarely understood each other. But dreams in Syria came with an expiration date, and hers was approaching fast. In 2011, the protests began. By 2012, Damascus was no longer a city of books and coffee houses. It was a city of checkpoints, disappearances, and fear. Layla's father was arrested at a faculty demonstration. For 6 months, the family had no word of him. And then one winter morning, his body was returned without explanation. No trial, no charges, just a sealed coffin and a warning not to ask questions. Her mother, broken but determined, sold everything. She used the last of their savings to secure a single exit visa for Layla. "You carry your father's gift now," she whispered at the border. "Do not let them bury it with you." Layla crossed into Jordan, then eventually made her way to Dubai on a temporary work permit. She had no copies of her degree. The university records had been destroyed in shelling. Her certificates, her transcripts, every official proof of who she was, gone. In the eyes of the Emirati system, Layla Hassan was not a linguist. She was an undocumented migrant with a high school equivalency at best. This is not Layla's story alone. Over 2 million college-educated immigrants in the United States find themselves underemployed or unemployed, their qualifications dismissed, their expertise invisible. In the Gulf, the problem is even more acute. Syrian refugees who once held advanced degrees now scrub floors and serve tables, not because they lack skill, but because the paperwork that proves those skills was left behind in burning buildings. The World Bank calls it brain waste. For the people living it, it feels like death by 1,000 paper cuts. Layla applied for dozens of jobs, translation agencies, language schools, corporate offices. Every interview ended the same way. "Do you have an attested degree certificate?" "No." "Do you have professional references we can verify?" "No." The door would close, and she would walk back into the furnace heat of Dubai's streets, where the skyline glittered with impossible wealth, and she was nothing. She eventually found work at Al Nafara, a high-end Lebanese restaurant in the financial district. The pay was enough to rent a bed in a shared room in Deira, to send a few hundred dirhams home to her mother and younger brother each month. She wore the uniform, carried the trays, smiled when required, and made herself as small as possible. That was the unwritten rule for people like her: be grateful, be invisible, be silent. But invisibility has a price. The men who sat at her tables, the bankers, the developers, the oil executives, they never saw her. She was a pair of hands that refilled their glasses, a shadow that cleared their plates. They spoke about her as if she could not understand English or French or the rapid-fire Emirati dialect they used among themselves. She understood every word. And then there was Omar ibn Rashid al-Hashimi. Omar was 52, the founder of Hashimi Properties, a man whose face appeared regularly on the cover of Arabian Business magazine. He had built a fortune developing luxury hotels across the Gulf, and he wore his success like a weapon. His reputation for ruthlessness was legendary. Suppliers who crossed him went bankrupt. Competitors who challenged him vanished from the market. He surrounded himself with people who laughed at his jokes, agreed with his opinions, and never, ever told him he was wrong. On this particular evening, Omar was celebrating. He had just closed a deal to acquire a chain of beachfront resorts in the Maldives, a transaction worth $400 million. His table at Al Nafara was the largest in the room, filled with his senior executives and a few carefully chosen guests who would toast his brilliance until the last bottle of champagne was empty. Layla was assigned to his table. The manager pulled her aside before the shift. "Mr. Al-Hashimi is a very important client. Do not speak unless spoken to. Do not make mistakes. Just serve and disappear." She nodded, her stomach tightening. She approached the table with a tray of appetizers, her movements precise from years of practice. The men laughed loudly, their conversation careless. One of them, a junior executive trying to impress his boss, pointed at Layla as she placed the dishes. "Look at this one, Omar. Probably doesn't even know what hummus is." Omar glanced at her, and something cruel flickered in his eyes. He was bored, and boredom made him dangerous. He set down his glass and raised his voice so the entire table could hear. "Tell me, girl, you look Syrian. How much Arabic do you actually know? Probably just hello and thank you, right?" He smirked. "I'll make you a deal. $7 million cash, no questions asked, if you can serve me properly in Arabic. Come on, let's hear it." The table erupted in laughter. The junior executives slapped the table. The other diners turned to watch. Layla stood frozen, tray in hand, every pair of eyes in the restaurant fixed on her. $7 million, a sum so absurd it was clearly meant to mock, not to offer. The humiliation was absolute. She felt the familiar instinct to shrink, to retreat, to become invisible once more. But then something rose inside her, not anger exactly, something older, her father's voice speaking to her across the dinner table in their Damascus apartment, the memory of a life where her words meant something. The knowledge that she carried a gift that no war, no lost documents, no arrogant CEO could ever erase. She set down the tray, she straightened her back, and she looked directly into Omar al-Hashimi's eyes. The laughter faltered, the room went quiet, and in perfectly modulated classical Arabic, the language of poets, of scholars, of kings, Layla began to speak. She did not raise her voice, she did not plead, and she did not insult. Instead, Layla Hassan served him with the flawless classical Arabic of scholarship and statecraft, the register reserved for ambassadors, poets, and treaties. She recited the full dish descriptions, described the wine pairings, and inquired about his preferences with a precision that silenced the snickering at his table one by one. Omar's smirk evaporated, but she did not stop there. Without missing a beat, she shifted into the Emirati dialect, matching the cadence of the Gulf with the ease of someone who had lived among its rhythms for years. She explained that in the country that had given her shelter, the language of welcome was not a weapon to humiliate strangers. The junior executive who had mocked her now stared at his plate. Then came French. She described how, at 12, she had translated Victor Hugo to comfort her father during the bombing raids, because beauty was the only refuge against the horror outside their windows. Her voice was steady, her eye contact brazen, and the restaurant's other patrons were now leaning in, phones raised. She moved into English, the global language of business, and informed Mr. Al-Hashimi that the $7 million he had tossed as a joke would be better spent building schools for children who knew as many verbs as he knew zeros in his bank account, and who deserved a future far more than he deserved another yacht. The women at table 7 broke into applause. Then Mandarin learned from a neighbor who had fled a different war. German from the elderly professor who had rented her family their last apartment before Damascus collapsed. Spanish, the language of a journalist she loved in another life. Russian, the tongue of her mother's favorite novels, the ones that burned with their home. Each language carried not just a demonstration of skill, but a capsule of her story, a witness to everything she had refused to surrender. Finally, she returned to Arabic, but this time the soft, intimate dialect of her father's household. She told Omar al-Hashimi that resilience was not measured by a person's current position, but by their refusal to be diminished. And she thanked him not for the mockery, but for giving her the exact stage she needed to remember who she truly was. The restaurant was silent, not the silence of fear, but the silence that follows a storm. Then, as if waking from a trance, the room burst into chaos. Someone shouted, "Shame on you," in Arabic at the executive table. Another diner, a Frenchwoman, ran up to Layla and pressed a business card into her hand, whispering that she must call tomorrow. The manager stood frozen, his VIP protocol in ruins, unsure whether to scold his server or applaud her. Omar al-Hashimi did not speak. His jaw was tight, his knuckles white around the stem of his champagne glass. He had been publicly dismantled by a woman he had viewed as furniture, and the humiliation was absolute. His bodyguard stepped forward, but Omar raised a hand. For the first time in decades, he had no words. He simply rose, straightened his jacket, and walked out, his entourage scrambling behind him like wounded birds. Layla finished her shift. She cleared the remaining plates, wiped down her section, and signed out at midnight. She walked to the metro station as she always did, but something had shifted inside her ribcage. She had spent years tiptoeing through a world that demanded her silence. Tonight she had spoken, and the echo was only beginning. By the time her train reached Deira, 4 separate videos of the confrontation were already climbing the trending charts. On Instagram, clips of her switching languages amassed thousands of views per minute. On Twitter, the hashtag 7 million lesson exploded, first in the Arab world, then globally. Journalists scrambled to identify the mysterious multilingual waitress who had humiliated a billionaire. The next morning, Layla woke to a phone that would not stop vibrating. Her roommate Nadia shoved it into her hands. "You're everywhere," she said. "Al Arabiya, BBC, CNN, they all want to talk to you." Layla scrolled through the headlines. "Waitress speaks 8 languages, stuns CEO. The lesson a billionaire will never forget. Syrian refugees' moment of grace breaks the internet." Her hands trembled, not from excitement, but from a lifetime of conditioning that told her that obscurity was safety. To be seen was to be vulnerable, and vulnerability, in her experience, invited pain, but the world would not let her retreat. By midday, Al Nafra's management had called an emergency meeting. A dozen journalists had gathered outside the restaurant. Some carried flowers, others carried microphones. A local influencer had tracked down her mother's village on Google Earth. The story was no longer just about a rude CEO, it was about every migrant who had been told their worth was less than zero, and every system that conspired to keep them there. Then came the phone call that changed the trajectory. It was from Omar al-Hashimi's office. Not a press statement, not a lawyer's threat, a personal request. Omar wanted to meet, face to face, without cameras, without entourage. David Chen's voice was carefully neutral, but the message was clear. The billionaire who had offered $7 million as a joke was now prepared to offer something real, and he was terrified she would say no. Layla hung up and stared at the wall. She had every reason to refuse. The man had tried to crush her spirit for the entertainment of his sycophants, but she also understood something that no amount of humiliation could erase. Power did not apologize by staying comfortable. Power apologized by ceding ground. And if Omar al-Hashimi was willing to cede ground, she would meet him, not as a supplicant, but as a force. 2 days after the confrontation, Layla walked into the same glass tower where Omar's empire was headquartered. She wore the same modest dress, the same dignity, the same quiet armor she had worn while serving appetizers. The elevator ride felt endless, but this time she was not climbing into uncertainty. She was ascending into consequence. Omar received her in his corner office, stripped of the usual entourage. He looked diminished, not physically, but in the way a man does when his own reflection has stopped obeying him. He spoke of his late wife, Amira, who had dreamed of funding schools for displaced children. He spoke of roads not taken, of a soul grown brittle with wealth. And then he made his offer, a genuine position as the company's Director of International Relations, with a mandate to build educational partnerships in conflict zones. No gimmicks, no cameras, no strings attached. Layla listened. She let the silence stretch. And then she asked the question no one in his universe had ever asked before. Why should I trust you? She did not refuse, not yet. But something in her gaze told him that this was not a negotiation he could win through money or status. This was a transaction of integrity, and his account was deeply overdrawn. Before he could answer, the office door burst open. Omar's chief legal counsel strode in, a thick file clutched to his chest, his face pale with alarm. He ignored Layla entirely. "Sir," he said, "we have a problem. Her immigration status, there's a flag in the system. The ministry just issued a stop order on her residency permit. If we don't resolve it in 7 days, she'll be deported back to Syria." The words landed like a grenade. Layla felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. Omar froze, his carefully constructed redemption collapsing before it could begin. And somewhere in the dark corners of the bureaucratic machine that had already tried to erase her once, a lever had been pulled, one that threatened to destroy not just her future, but her very presence in the country that had become her home. The stop order was no bureaucratic accident. The legal counsel, a gray-haired Emirati named Rashid, spread the documents across Omar's desk with trembling hands. The complaint had been filed at 8:47 that morning, less than 2 hours after the viral videos hit the national news. Someone had moved with lightning speed to weaponize the immigration system. And the signature on the order belonged to a senior official in the Ministry of Human Resources, a man named Tariq Al-Mansouri, who had been Omar's chief rival for government construction contracts for 15 years. Layla could barely breathe. Deportation to Syria was not an administrative inconvenience, it was a death sentence. The war had swallowed her father. It had reduced her childhood home to rubble. Returning without papers, without protection, without a university diploma that existed only in memory, meant walking into a void where people like her simply disappeared. Omar's face hardened. He had spent decades climbing the ladder of Dubai's power structure, and he knew exactly how this game was played. Al-Mansouri had seen the footage. He had watched Omar, his lifelong competitor, be humiliated by a refugee waitress. And then he had seen Omar extend an olive branch, invite her to his office, offer her a position that would be splashed across every newspaper as a redemption arc. That was unacceptable. Better to deport the girl and let Omar twist in the wind, his grand gesture exposed as empty theater. But the plot ran deeper than a single rival's grudge. Rashid flipped to the next page. The initial flag on her residency had been triggered not by Al-Mansouri's office, but by a call from a phone registered to Hashemi Properties' own security division. Someone inside Omar's company had handed Al-Mansouri the ammunition. Someone sitting right down the hall. Layla watched the revelation land on Omar like a physical blow. His empire, the thing he had built from sand and ambition, had been compromised by a viper in his own nest. And the viper, they soon discovered, was Khalid al-Rashid, not the billionaire from the earlier story, but a different Khalid, his chief operating officer and the man who had sat at his table that night, laughing the loudest at Layla's expense. Khalid had feared that Omar's public softening would undermine the company's hard-nosed reputation. Worse, he had been in secret talks with Al-Mansouri for months, plotting a hostile takeover that would leave Omar as chairman emeritus with no real power. The deportation order was meant to distract Omar while the coup unfolded. But here was the unexpected turn. The legal machinery that Khalid had set in motion could not be easily stopped. Even if Omar exposed the conspiracy, the ministry would not simply reverse an order without a formal appeal, which took months. And Layla had 7 days. 6 now. The "it gets worse" moment arrived the following morning. A second notice appeared, this one from the Immigration Enforcement Division. Her roommates in Deira had been questioned at dawn. 2 of them, also Syrian refugees with precarious statuses, were now facing deportation too. The press, which had celebrated Layla as a hero 48 hours earlier, was suddenly running headlines about illegal workers exploiting viral fame. The same television anchors who had praised her linguistic genius were now asking whether Dubai should tolerate refugees who overstayed their welcome. Layla felt the walls closing. She had become a symbol, but not the one she intended. She was now a pawn in a power struggle between billionaires, her life and her family's future reduced to collateral damage. Then something shifted. The Frenchwoman who had pressed a business card into her hand at the restaurant, her name was Colette Marchand, reappeared. Colette was not just a diner, she was the Middle East bureau chief for Le Monde, and she had been investigating labor rights violations in the Gulf for 2 years. She had access to documents that other journalists had never seen, including a leaked memo from al-Mansouri's office discussing the deportation as a reputational correction for Omar al-Hashimi. Colette met Layla in a quiet cafe far from the glass towers. She laid out the evidence, the phone call from Khalid's direct line, the time-stamped emails coordinating with the ministry, the financial transaction that proved al-Mansouri had received a gift of 2 million dirhams routed through an offshore shell company. This was not merely a personal vendetta. It was a criminal conspiracy to manipulate the immigration system for corporate gain. And if it became public, it would implicate not just Khalid and al-Mansouri, but the entire network of enablers who had allowed it. Layla faced an impossible choice. If she went public with Colette, she would make enemies of the most powerful men in Dubai. Her deportation might be expedited. Her family back in Syria might be targeted. But if she stayed silent, she would be on a plane to Damascus in a week, and her roommates would follow, along with countless other refugees whose fates would never make the news. The story was no longer about one woman's dignity. It was about whether a system that crushed the invisible could ever be held to account. Omar, meanwhile, was wagging his own war. He confronted Khalid in the executive boardroom, their shouts audible through the soundproofed walls. He threatened to dissolve the company before letting a traitor take it. But Khalid had already mobilized his allies. The board was split. A vote of no confidence was scheduled for the same day Layla's deportation would be finalized, a brutal piece of scheduling meant to force Omar to choose, his company or the refugee. But Omar had been changed by something he could not explain. Maybe it was the memory of Amira whispering to him in his dreams. Maybe it was the fact that this young woman, who had lost everything, had refused to break even when he taunted her with $7 million. He had offered her a job as a gesture, but now he realized that gesture was hollow unless he fought for her with more than money. He had to fight with sacrifice. He called Layla that night, his voice raw. "I will not let them deport you," he said. "If I have to burn every bridge I've ever built, I will not let them win." Layla listened. She did not trust him, not fully. Trust was a luxury she had abandoned somewhere on the road out of Damascus, but she recognized the sound of a man who had finally found something worth losing everything for, and she told him about Colette's evidence. The two threads converged on the 6th day. Colette's story was ready for publication, a massive exposé with documents, timelines, and testimony from other workers who had been silenced. Omar, with the help of a few loyal board members, had uncovered even more. Khalid had been funneling company funds to al-Mansouri for years, greasing the wheels of an entire parallel economy built on exploitation. The night before the board vote and the deportation deadline, they gathered in Colette's hotel room. Layla, Omar, Colette, and a young human rights lawyer named Fatima who had taken Layla's case pro bono. They held the power to burn the whole system down. But doing so would require Layla to step into the brightest spotlight imaginable, to tell her story not as the viral sensation who spoke 8 languages, but as a refugee who had been targeted for daring to exist in a space reserved for the powerful. If she did, there was no guarantee she would be allowed to stay. The ministry could still find a reason to deport her, and the courts might take years to clear her name. But if she stayed silent, she would be on a plane to Syria, and the men who tried to destroy her would face no consequences at all. Layla looked at the faces around her. She thought of her father, whose body had been returned in a sealed box because he had dared to speak. She thought of her mother, who had sold everything so that Layla could cross a border and carry their legacy. And she thought of the thousands of refugees scrubbing toilets and serving tables across Dubai, invisible, silent, trapped waiting for someone to prove that their lives mattered. She took the stack of documents from Colette's hand. She walked to the window, the skyline of a city that had given her asylum, and then tried to take it away, glittering against the darkness. And then she turned back to the room. "I have spent my whole life hiding," she said. "I will not hide anymore. Publish it, all of it. And if they deport me, let the world see what they are deporting." Dawn was 3 hours away. The board vote was at 9. The deportation was scheduled for noon, and at 7 sharp, Colette's story would go live to 8 million readers worldwide. The clock began its final countdown, and for the first time, the powerful men who had moved Layla like a piece on their chessboard had no idea that the game was about to flip. At 7 in the morning, Colette Marchand pressed publish. The Le Monde investigation went live with the headline, "The Price of Mockery: How a Billionaire's Joke Exposed a Criminal Conspiracy in Dubai." Within minutes, the story was translated into Arabic, English, French, and Mandarin. It carried everything: the recorded phone call from Khalid's office triggering the deportation flag, the timestamps of coordination with al-Mansouri, the offshore payment of 2 million dirhams, and the internal emails that proved the conspiracy was aimed not at Layla alone, but at silencing Omar's redemption and seizing his company. Below the investigative text, Colette had embedded a single, unedited video. Layla in the restaurant, switching through 8 languages with quiet fury, her voice steady, her dignity unbreakable. The internet ignited, not the slow burn of likes and shares, but a detonation. Within the first hour, the Le Monde article crashed under the weight of global traffic. News outlets from the BBC to Al Jazeera to the New York Times scrambled to run second-day stories that now had to be entirely rewritten. The 2 million views that Layla's original viral clip had amassed now seemed quaint. 40 million people watched the new footage before breakfast. The hashtag Layla taught them trended in 14 languages. And the narrative that had briefly turned against her, the whispered suggestions of illegal workers and overstayed welcomes, evaporated under the harsh light of documented corruption. At the Ministry of Human Resources, panic erupted. Tariq al-Mansouri had not expected exposure. His entire career had been built on exercising power in the shadows, where no reporter could follow. But now every detail of his deal with Khalid was public, and the minister's phone was ringing off the hook. By 8:30, the government's official communications office issued a statement. The stop order on Layla Hassan's residency had been reviewed and found to be procedurally irregular. An immediate investigation was launched into al-Mansouri's conduct. He was suspended from his post pending a full inquiry. The deportation deadline, scheduled for noon, was frozen indefinitely. At Hashemi Properties headquarters, the boardroom was a pressure cooker. Khalid had arrived early, confident that his allies would deliver the no-confidence vote and hand him control. But as the board members took their seats, their phones buzzed with the Le Monde alert. One by one, they read the documents. They saw Khalid's name. They saw the payments. They watched their own reputations teeter on the edge of a cliff. By the time Omar walked in, escorted not by his usual security detail, but by a single young attorney holding the evidence file, the room had already turned. Khalid tried to deflect. He called it a fabrication, a smear campaign by a disgruntled journalist. But Omar did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He simply projected the documents onto the boardroom screen, the phone logs, the bank transfers, the email in which Khalid had written, "This Syrian girl is our leverage. Use her to break Omar before the vote." The silence that followed was the silence of a career ending. Khalid was escorted from the building by legal compliance officers. The vote was cancelled. There was no longer anything to vote on. Omar remained at the helm, but something had fundamentally shifted in the way he held that power. At 10:30, Layla received the call from the immigration authority. Her residency permit had been reinstated with full legal status. Not only that, but the ministry, desperate to salvage its image, had expedited a humanitarian visa category for her roommates and 3 other Syrian workers who had been swept up in the original order. The deportation vans that had been idling outside their apartment building in Deira drove away empty. Nadia, The roommate who had shoved the phone into Layla's hands on that first chaotic morning collapsed weeping in the doorway. They were safe, all of them. But the most unexpected call came at 11. It was from a woman Layla had never heard of, a professor of linguistics at Damascus University named Dr. Hayat Al-Sabag. She had been following the story from her office in the capital, and she had a message. The university, in an effort to honor Layla's father and his legacy, had initiated a posthumous restoration of his academic records. All of Dr. Samir Hassan's publications, his teaching credentials, his entire body of work, they were being digitally reconstructed from archives, colleagues' memories, and what remained of the faculty's records. And with that reconstruction came an invitation. Should Layla ever wish to present her father's papers to a new generation of students, the university would welcome her as a visiting lecturer. No diploma required. The evidence of her mind was sufficient. Layla sat very still after that call. She had spent years believing that her father's gift was buried, that her credentials were ashes. But here, at the moment of her greatest vindication, the world was returning something she had thought lost forever. She was not just a survivor. She was a custodian of a lineage, and that lineage was suddenly, miraculously, visible again. At noon, the hour that had been reserved for her deportation, Layla stood in the conference room of Hashemi Properties, facing a bank of cameras and a crowd of journalists who had flown in from 3 continents. Omar stood beside her, but he was not the story. He knew that. He had hired a crisis communications team, but he had also drafted a handwritten letter, a private apology to Layla for the humiliation he had caused. It was not part of the press strategy. He simply gave it to her before the cameras rolled, folded in an envelope with no audience. She read it, folded it back, and nodded once. That was all. Then she spoke. Not in the 8 languages of her viral moment, but in the universal language of a woman who had refused to disappear. She talked about the 2 million college-educated immigrants who cannot use their degrees, the refugees who scrub floors because their paperwork was lost to war, the systems that treat dignity as a privilege rather than a right. She talked about her father, whose body had been returned in a box, and about the students who would now read his works because a story had forced the world to listen. She talked about the girls in Syrian refugee camps who spoke 3 languages and dreamed of universities that might never accept them. And she announced that her new role, the position Omar had offered, would not be a corporate sinecure. It would be a platform. The Hashemi Foundation for Displaced Scholars would fund the credential validation, educational placement, and professional mentorship of 10,000 refugees over the next 5 years. Layla would direct it, with full autonomy, funded by a $100 million endowment drawn from Omar's personal fortune, not company profits. That detail had been negotiated in the 48 hours since the Le Monde story broke. Fatima, the human rights lawyer, had drafted the legal framework. Colette had brought in a philanthropic advisor from Médecins Sans Frontières. Omar had signed the endowment papers at 8 that morning, before the board meeting, knowing that it might be his last act as CEO. He had not told Layla until after the board vote, because he wanted her to know that the money was not contingent on his victory. It was contingent on nothing at all. In the weeks that followed, life changed for Layla Hassan. She moved into a modest apartment in the city, no longer a shared room in Deira. She sent money home and visited her mother via video call, showing her the university's restoration website with her father's name on it. She testified to the parliamentary inquiry that had been launched into immigration abuse, her testimony broadcast live. Khalid and Al-Mansouri were indicted on multiple counts, their trial set for the following spring. The Hashemi Foundation opened its first office in a renovated school building in Amman, Jordan, where displaced Syrian students could walk in and have their credentials assessed by a team of specialists. Layla herself interviewed the first 10 candidates, each one a linguistic prodigy or a former professor who had been waiting tables just like she had. But there was one detail that Layla kept to herself, something she never shared in interviews. On the day the foundation launched, she received a letter from a woman she had never met, a cleaning lady at the Kempinski Hotel in Amman. The woman wrote in classical Arabic, the language of poets, and she said this: "I saw you on the television. I speak 5 languages. My diploma is buried under building in Aleppo. For years I believed I was no one. Today I looked in the mirror and heard your voice saying my name. Thank you for returning me to myself." Layla framed that letter and hung it above her desk. Not for the cameras, not for the story, but for the proof. Because she understood, finally, that the most dangerous thing in the world is not a billionaire's mockery or a corrupt official scheme. The most dangerous thing is a single person who discovers that what they know and who they are cannot be taken from them. Everything else is just noise. The documentaries, the follow-up headlines, the policy reforms, all of that would unfold in the months and years ahead. But right here, in the quiet of the Foundation's first office, Layla Hassan began the work of giving back what war and bureaucracy had stolen. And that work would continue long after the cameras left, long after the hashtags faded, long after the world found a new sensation to obsess over. This was not a viral moment anymore. This was a movement, and she was just getting started. Layla Hassan's story spread far beyond Dubai. In the months after the Foundation launched, universities across Europe and North America reached out to partner. A coalition of refugee advocacy groups used her case as a legal precedent, successfully arguing that credential discrimination was a form of systemic exclusion. The viral clip, which had started as a moment of humiliation, became required viewing in management courses teaching executives what not to do. But the deeper truth is that Layla is not an exception. She is a mirror. For every refugee whose linguistic genius is captured on camera and celebrated, there are tens of thousands whose brilliance remains invisible, stacking shelves, mopping floors, their degrees buried under rubble, their voices silenced by systems that judge worth by paperwork rather than potential. The World Bank estimates that closing the skill mismatch for displaced professionals could inject billions into the global economy. But beyond the economics, there is a simpler, more urgent reality. Dignity costs nothing to give and everything to withhold. Omar al-Hashimi learned that lesson the hard way. The man who once offered $7 million as a joke now chairs a board that funds schools in conflict zones. He rarely gives interviews anymore, but when asked about his transformation, he repeats a single line: "She did not just save my company. She saved me from becoming a man my late wife would not recognize." As for Layla, she continues her work from Amman, traveling between camps and capitals, building bridges out of words. She still speaks 8 languages, but she will tell you she is learning a 9th, the language of hope, which sounds different in every dialect but means the same thing everywhere. Her father's books are being republished. Her siblings are in school. And somewhere, in a cramped apartment or a refugee tent, another young woman is watching her story, realizing that what she carries inside her cannot be erased by war or arrogance or time. If this story moved you, please like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel for more stories of courage and transformation. Let us know in the comments, what would you have said if you were at that table? And remember, the next time you encounter someone whose accent or job title suggests they are less than you might just be standing in the presence of a person who could humble you in 8 languages. The only question is whether you will be wise enough to listen.